The following webinar was recorded as part of the original implementation of IWISH and has been made available for informational purposes only. Some portions of the original recording have been cut to ensure participants' privacy. References to the Lewin Group, implementation team, site liaisons, PHL, Google Drive, and some forms are not applicable to the demonstration extension effective October 1st, 2020. Terms and conditions of grantee's cooperative agreement supersede any information presented here. Please see the IWISH Operations Manual for the most up-to-date implementation information.
To take with participants' health information. So again, the focus of today is to talk about confidentiality within the context of the IWISH demonstration. And so as you listen to the information, think about how what you're hearing helps you to answer these questions.
Indicated the two things we really want you to think about as you listen to this very important component of IWISH on confidentiality is how you might need to change what you're doing when you interact with residents to maintain their confidentiality, and also kind of what precautions you might need to take, particularly with their health information. We can go to the next slide. So two confidentiality considerations. Privacy of confidential client information during all phases of IWISH administration and delivery. So that's collecting, storing, and sharing the data. And there will be different times that you will be doing all three of those activities and in different contexts. So we'll talk about that. PII, which is a term of art, personally identifiable information. It's not just someone's name. It's other client characteristics such as their race, ethnicity, gender, age, address, phone number, anything that in combination could identify them. So that's an important concept for this. Go to the next slide. We need to ensure the confidentiality of people's names and other PII, as well as their health-related information. And in order to do that, we need to make sure there's adequate protections in place, some of which you established when you set up your offices within the site with locked filing cabinets and other sorts of things. We need written procedures and policies on confidentiality, and at the end of this, you will be asked to do an attestation about having participated in this presentation and understand kind of the responsibilities. And we will be conducting kind of periodic monitoring of confidentiality procedures just through your conversations with your site liaisons. Next slide. So all of you who are existing service coordinators had to maintain confidentiality of the residents during your normal course of work prior to IWISH. But one of the important aspects of IWISH is now you'll be responsible for some health information, both collecting and maintaining that. And so an important federal regulation and privacy rule comes into play there, and it's short for HIPAA. If we go to the next slide, and HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And within that federal law, there were a number of provisions, but the ones that we're going to focus on are ones that protect a patient's privacy as it relates to their personal and health information. It talks about the physical and electronic security for that information, and it specifies the rights of the patients to approve and access and use their medical information. And so we're borrowing, even though you are not, as a housing site, a HIPAA provider, we are going to adopt several of those tenets within the requirements in order to uphold the standards. Because HIPAA really just applies to healthcare providers who furnish, bill, or receive payment for healthcare in the normal course of business. So the wellness nurse's employer, generally either a home health agency or a hospital, they are a HIPAA-covered provider, but as the housing site and as the contractor for the wellness nurse, Technically, we're not subject to HIPAA transactions, but we are going to, like I said, abide by the privacy rules and provisions. So a little bit more on HIPAA. It includes 4 components. Next slide. The privacy rule, the security rule, a breach notification rule, and the enforcement rule. We'll talk about the first 3. The enforcement is very specific to, again, if you're a HIPAA provider and it involves penalties and all kinds of things, that piece of it will not apply here, but the other 3 definitely are part of this. Go to the next slide. So about the privacy rule. Next slide. It established national standards for protecting medical records and personal health information. And it required safeguards to protect that privacy and also set limits and conditions on the use and disclosures. And it gives the patient, or the resident in this case, rights over that information. And the privacy rule, the Federal Register site is down below there if you're very interested in reading the regulatory language. But we'll keep talking about it within the context of where we are. So if we go to the next slide, it protects all individually identifiable health information held or transmitted by a covered entity or its business associate in any form, media, whether electronic, paper, or oral. So it's all circumstances. And like I said, as the IWISH sites are not considered a covered entity, but these privacy provisions do apply. So what is PHI? On the next slide, we talk about anything from the past, the present, or the future related to physical or mental health or condition, and the provision of health care to the individual or the payment for the provision of health care to the individual. Again, you will probably have information around these first 2 and not the third one. Go to the next slide. So we're going to try something different here again. If we go to the whiteboard, each person, if you have a keyboard in front of you, try typing what an example of personal health information might be. See if this works. So if I go over the pen and type it's not working for me. Oh, somebody's worked for date of birth. I was going to try to type blood pressure, because that would be health information. A medical diagnosis, absolutely. The Medicare number ID, yep. Anybody else successful with the whiteboard? Have something to share in terms of an example of private health information? Here goes blood pressure, another date of birth. Blood test results, absolutely. X-rays, labs, notes from the physician, all that is private health information. Thank you. All right, can we go back to the slides? Mastered another engagement technique, guys. Good job. So if we go to the next slide, within IWISH, the private health information, as you noted, was a resident health and wellness assessment, which you'll hear more about over the next several weeks leading up to the in-person event. But it will include demographic data, birth date, social security number, health history. We're also going to be tracking when you engage with residents, so what types of assistance you're providing, referrals, notes, participation in any of the evidence-based wellness activities and programming. And then there could also be sharing with their primary health care or with a discharge planner or other health service providers or partners that you're going to engage as permitted by the resident. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. So if we go to the next slide. So we're going to talk after this slide a little bit about unintentional data sharing, but I wanted you to think a little bit and type into chat before we got there about how you might unintentionally end up sharing either PII or PHI, so personally identifiable information or private health information. So if you could type in the chat board, and Joy, if you want to go ahead and look at the answers.
So yeah, as Lisa said, we want to hear from you in the chat. As a reminder, be sure to select all participants when you are entering in your response into the chat. So when you are being overheard, so I guess you're talking maybe you're in an open space, like perhaps in an office, but your door isn't closed, and so people can overhear your conversation. That's a great answer, Mindy. And that has reminders why we do ask you all to have a meeting space where you can keep the door closed. The phone when someone walks by that you weren't aware of. Good answer. If you're having a conversation perhaps on your cell phone and moving around, residents or other people can hear you. Some other responses we have, Lisa, is residents may hear outside the office door if someone is eavesdropping, asking any question outside of the office if you are discussing with other staff. Someone said, oh, Karen says if a resident needs a reasonable accommodation for their apartment and you share it as part of an explanation to the PM, I'm assuming PM means property manager. Yeah. Maria, if your file cabinet is left unlocked, ooh, that would definitely cause you to unintentionally share. Leaving paperwork on the desk and having someone come in unexpectedly to see you. These are some really, really great responses. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. I don't know if she has anything to add in response before she continues her presentation.
Well, if we go to the next slide, you guys hit it on the head. So unintentional data sharing is when, by either mistake or oversight or an incorrect assumption, sharing happens. And so it's important that all the staff members at a property kind of understand these confidentiality policies and the procedures. And as I noted, we're going to ask the resident wellness directors and the wellness nurses to sign a confidentiality agreement. If we go to the next slide, one of the additional ways is you can post notices about the importance of maintaining confidentiality, in your office so that both the residents and you are reminded. And any third-party inquiry about verifying or getting information about a resident who is participating in IWISH requires a release of information form. And in the materials that were sent out along with the slides earlier today were this release of information form. I'm sorry, that's not included. That will actually be covered in the next webinar when we get into some of the enrollments and ongoing paperwork forms, etc. So you'll hear more about the release of information in the next webinar on Thursday. We go to the next slide. Some of the exceptions about disclosure that will be included in the IWISH informed consent. Again, something that will be a topic of Thursday's webinar is if somebody is a victim of abuse, neglect, or domestic violence, if you need to share information with Adult Protective Services because you suspect abuse, neglect, or if the person might be a danger to themselves, when it's required by a legal court order, or if there's a fraudulent activity or suspected other violations of the law or the lease. In those circumstances, there might be disclosure of some of the either PII or potentially PHI. So we go to the next slide, and the next. So some of the safeguards for both, being intentional about not sharing where you shouldn't be is this training today. We will be using a secure platform for entering and housing the data. And we actually, one of the second document in addition to the attestation that was included in the materials for today is a data sharing and confidentiality agreement that a site representative will be asked to sign. The What we sent out is in draft form, and we're not quite ready to start providing access to the platform yet. So when we get to that point, we will be going ahead and asking a representative from the site to be signing those forms and returning those to us to gain access to the platform. We've got procedures and forms, again, like we're going to discuss more on Thursday, with the operations manual, which you will be getting in advance of the in-person. It also has some suggestions, and then the implementation team is available to support you. The next slide, we talk a little bit more about collecting data in PHL. Again, we've talked about this before. All the properties will be using that to enter data for those who are participating. PHL is a HIPAA compliant system. It's undergoing a high trust certification, which is the highest level of security certification. There is also a system of records notification certification that HUD is conducting, and that will be approved, and the notice for that will be going out shortly. So all of that is important for guaranteeing and maintaining the privacy of the data that will be entered. Due to the privacy constraints, data on residents not participating in the demonstration cannot be kept on the PHL data platform. That's because those of us on the implementation team will have access to it, and if they have not agreed to participate in the demonstration, we should not have access to their data. Okay, the next slide. So some best practices, and we got at this at some of the, with some of the unintentional revealing of information. So when you're gathering information, avoid discussing about residents in common places where somebody might overhear you. Use a closed door for when you're discussing private information, either in person or over the phone. And again, part of the informed consent will be having the residents, reviewing with the resident who is agreeing to participate the privacy policies and having them sign that so they understand that also. And some of the physical security measures are that secure hard copy records in the locked filing cabinet, not leaving them on printers, copiers, fax machines, tables, shred as appropriate, and make sure your computer monitor is not, you can see behind me, I have a door. If my door is open, everybody can see my computer monitor. It's probably better not to do that and to have the monitor to the side. Now this is my laptop, so I can move it around wherever I want. We go to the next slide. On the electronic data, best practices again, for the platform we're going to have everybody has their own secure password, and we would ask that you keep that password secure so no one else can see it or use it, and then to log out of the database whenever you leave the office. Same applies to your computer. You need a secure password for your computer or tablet. If resident information is on a network drive, you need to make sure that's only accessible to the resident wellness director and the wellness nurse. Log out of that computer whenever you're leaving the office. And if you're taking a laptop or tablet off-site, you should be using a lockbox for any files or laptops or tablets, so that others can't get to that information. Go to the next slide. It's on sharing data, so that data can be shared on a limited basis. You want to limit the number of staff who have access to data. Within the informed consent, it notes the resident wellness director, the wellness nurse, and their supervisors. And the reason to include the supervisors is so that if you all need to confer with your supervisor about a particular situation, then you have ability to do that. And you don't need to reveal the person's name and the other sorts of details if you don't have to. So as enough information to need to know in order to be helpful, but not oversharing in those situations. The release of information will allow you to share information with other partners, with other health providers, with anyone, with the participants' family members, so that can all be captured there. If they've signed a release of information form, you can share information with those individuals, but anybody not on that list, you may not share information with. There'll be agreements that you'll establish with your IWISH partners. But again, the ROI is that key to sharing an individual participant's information. And finally, you can monitor the process. Part of the monitoring the process is having these policies and procedures to ensure confidentiality, and then taking precautions to protect that and limit exposure of identifiable information in the training that we're doing right now. If we go to the next slide. So in chat, can you tell us which of these best practices you might already use in your day-to-day interactions with residents? So we have to go off the whiteboard and back to chat, sorry.
Yeah, enter into the chat which of the best practices that Lisa has shared do you already use? You know that some of you all have been doing some great things with your residents previously, so what do you do in order to protect their information? To maintain Renee said, oh, we have some couple responses. They're coming so quickly, I love it. Locking the file cabinet, double and triple checking to make sure the file cabinet is locked. Closing the door and hanging a do not disturb sign. That's a great idea because even with the door closed, people sometimes think they can enter. Let's see, lock files and doors, not leaving paperwork on the desk when you leave the office. Great. What else? Consent to release, white noise makers. I've never heard that. White noise makers, interesting.
Yeah, so that's, we actually have them in the office here, Joy, with the cubicles. It's sort of a background noise that kind of absorbs conversations to some extent.
Oh, cool. I don't have any confidential conversations, but if I did, I definitely would want some of those. Let's see. When having a conversation with a resident in a public area, I ask them to come to a private area to continue the discussion. Great idea. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Lisa. It looks like a lot of people are saying that they lock their cabinets, they close their door, and that they have conversations in private areas.
Let's talk about a potential case study here. So, you know, you're 3-4 months down the road here, and you have a participant who you've received hospital discharge instructions. The hospital shared it with you with the participant's permission, and the participant is also willing to have their daughter have the discharge instructions. And so you have those. You're going to you're emailing them to the daughter, and you realize that you inadvertently attached the wrong one, the wrong discharge summary, so somebody else's discharge summary. You try to recall the message, but you're not able to. And so first thing you do is you call the daughter and tell her, please, delete that because it wasn't intended for you, and I'm really sorry. It didn't mean to do that. Without opening it, preferably. So the question is, do you consider that a breach of privacy? And if you could type in, we should have done a poll on this, but if you could type in what you think, yes or no. Seeing lots of yeses, and yes, it is a privacy breach, even if you got the daughter to delete it before, she opened it up. It is a privacy breach, and we're going to have a form. I, as the principal investigator for the demonstration portion of this and for guaranteeing the privacy and confidentiality of the participants, need to be notified when there is a breach. you're not going to be punished for it. We're just going to talk about how do we avoid it the next time, but we do need to know about it and figure out what to do next. That's one example. A second example is, you have your laptop with all your information on it. Now, fortunately, the information is for PHL is actually stored in the cloud. It won't be stored on your laptop, on your hard drive. But if you were keeping your own notes on a laptop, and that laptop was stolen and it had notes with PHI for participants, that would also be a breach, and we would need to do a breach assessment form and figure out next steps for that. So we're taking this very seriously and want to make sure that all the participants are comfortable and know that their information will be protected, and if there is a problem where it has been breached, that we will let them know and we will take steps to correct the situation. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about confidentiality breaches. Go to the next slide. So breach occurs when there's an unauthorized or unintentional exposure or disclosure of that personal information. Most states have legislation requiring notification, and you should, if there are relevant state legislation or professional guidelines that apply, you should also adhere to those, but we'll have ones as part of the study, again, that will get reported to me as the principal investigator. And also you'll work with your site liaison in order to mitigate any breaches. Go to the next slide. What we'll want to know is how it occurred, what data, and who was affected. We would ask you to take any immediate steps to secure the data. Again, if like the daughter who gets the wrong discharge, ask her to delete that email immediately without opening it. Attempt to retrieve or secure any stolen or lost data. And then again, notify the site liaison, and the site liaison will notify me also. Go to the next slide.